Guten Tag. In this video I will provide you with answers to the top 12 questions most sourdough bakers have. This will help you to step up your sourdough game and make better bread at home. A few videos ago I showed you how to make the perfect sourdough starter, and I asked you to please provide me some questions in the comment section. And I picked the top 12 questions which I think are super useful, especially if you're just getting started with making sourdough bread. I'm going to be adding chapters to this video so that you can skip ahead to the parts that interest you the most, that also makes rewatching simpler. And this is the agenda for this video. Those will be the 12 questions we are going to cover. When is the starter in optimal shape to be used? Can you boost the starter with fruits? Or with kombucha or kefir? What's the perfect temperature for making a sourdough starter, especially during summer or winter times? What changes? How to achieve a more mild or more sour flavor? Help, my dough doesn't rise after adding the sourdough starter. My starter smells like acetone, what's wrong? Can I change the flour that I feed my starter from whole wheat to rye, emmer, einkorn? Can I just change that? I just made a stiff starter and for some reason it doesn't increase in size, what's wrong? Can you dehydrate your sourdough starter for long-term storage? How much starter should I use to make the perfect sourdough bread? When making a starter, you pile up some discard. For how long can I keep this inside of my fridge? And lastly, my favorite question of them all, could you collect all the sourdough starters of this community to make the mega starter? I'm gonna keep the best one for last. Number 1, when is the sourdough starter in optimal shape to be used? Carefully rotate the jar of your starter. Do you see bubbles on the side? That's a good indicator. Does it increase a little bit in size? It doesn't have to double, it doesn't have to triple, just a little bit is a good indicator. Please open your starter jar and smell your starter. It should either smell slightly dairy or maybe a little bit vinegary. If your starter has been in the fridge for a long period of time, it might be that your bacteria to yeast ratio is a little bit off. It could take longer for your starter to reactivate. That's why when storing my starter in the fridge, I sometimes like to give it an additional feeding. If your starter is dried or frozen, it might take even longer. But my biggest learning is really to evaluate the starter using my nose. It helps a lot. Number 2, can I boost my sourdough starter with kefir, kombucha or other fruits? Yes, you totally can. In fact, many starters are made with fruits initially. There's wild yeast everywhere. Just when using wild fruits, be very careful. You should have the acidifying component. The acidifying component will kill all the germs that you don't want. So it's very important that your starter at some point gets quite sour. The low pH sort of has a pickling effect. Of course, if you start with a kefir or a kombucha, the microorganisms might not be so good at fermenting flour. So it might be that a starter made from flour is actually better at doing that job. Of course, over time, your microorganisms are also going to adapt. They're going to become better and better at fermenting flour. You would definitely be adding some interesting microorganisms to the mix. I'm wondering how the flavor would change from a kombucha starter. Number 3, what about temperature for sourdough starters? The temperature here in Germany changes quite a lot. We do have seasons. And based on the temperature, things are either going to be way faster or way slower. But it doesn't really matter. I always keep my sourdough starter at room temperature. So don't worry too much about that at all. Please use your nose again to smell the sourdough starter. One thing I like to do in wintertime, sometimes when I want my starter to be ready a little bit faster, what I do is I just use warmer water to feed the starter. Of course, everything is going to cool down, but this really gives a big boost. In summertime, things for me are typically double as fast compared to winter. So yeah, in winter everything is way slower. That's why I'm also using a little bit more sourdough starter when I make a bread in winter times. If you don't have any seasons, if it's always hot where you live, then you want to be using even less sourdough starter to make bread. Number 4, how to achieve a more mild or more sour flavor? Super interesting question. And this was one of my most eye-opening moments of making sourdough bread. I changed my starter from 100% hydration, which everybody typically has, to a 500% hydration. So 1 part flour, 5 parts water. And what happens there is that the acetic acid bacteria that are creating acetic acid can no longer survive. Making acetic acid requires oxygen. And so I sort of got rid of all that acetic flavor, and I only had dairy notes left. My sourdough bread would taste very dairy, super delicious. Lactic acid is actually more sour than acetic acid, but the perceived flavor is not as sour. So more lactic acid might be perceived as less sour actually. And then I changed my liquid starter back to a stiff starter. And what happens there is that the yeast part of your starter is more boosted, so you'll have more fluffiness. You also won't run into over-fermentation issues as quickly. And the microorganisms that changed while I made the liquid starter still persisted in the stiff starter. And this was really interesting, because now I have a sourdough starter that's creating very fluffy bread with mild acidity. Generally, if you want to make things more sour, you just have to ferment for longer. Your dough is going to become very sticky. The best thing to do then is to probably use a loaf pan to make your bread. If you want to make a freestanding loaf, you definitely need to have a strong flour at hand, something with a high gluten content, because over time your bacteria is going to eat all that gluten, which means your dough can't hold the structure as much anymore. Number 5, why doesn't my dough rise after adding the starter? If you just made a starter, it might not be so good at fermenting flour yet. So a couple of more feedings are going to help your starter to grow into the direction of becoming a flour fermenting monster. If it's very cold where you live, things might also just be a little bit slower. At some point you should see some activity. If you don't, then your starter might not be ready yet. Keep feeding it over a few more days. Number 6, my starter smells like acetone. What's wrong? Great question here, and that's super cool because every sourdough starter is completely unique. You have different microorganisms than I have, and I think this makes it so interesting. This is also why it's so hard to follow recipes like that, because your starter is always going to behave a little bit different. That's why I studied this channel. You probably have more acetic acid bacteria, and that's completely normal. That can happen. I noticed this especially when making starters from rye flour initially, like I do quite a lot. If you want to change that, please explore the option of making a liquid starter out of your existing starter. You're gonna boost more the lactic acid producing bacteria. I like that flavor a little bit more, but if you want to make a hearty rye bread, then I think your acetone flavor is gonna work very, very nicely. And a lot of this acid is actually evaporating during the baking process. So nothing to worry. Number 7, can I change the flour that I feed my starter? Yes, you totally can. I don't have a rye starter or a wheat starter. I always have the same starter and I change the flour frequently. So my starter is very good at fermenting different flours. Just change the flour that you want to use. If you initially start a starter, then a wholemeal flour is quite good because you have more wild yeast and more bacteria on the hull of the grain. The biggest factor for deciding which flour you use is which taste do you want to have inside of your main dough. Do you want wheat, rye, spelt, emmer, einkorn? This should be the factor deciding which flour are you going to feed your starter. Oh, and please don't rely so much on the float test. It doesn't always work. If you typically have a low gluten flour, it might be that your starter is simply not able to float on top of the water. So the float test is a tool that you can use, but you have to be a little bit careful when using it. Number 8, my stiff starter is not active. What's wrong? If you just change to a stiff starter, this means that you will boost more yeast activity. You will make fluffier bread and you can use weaker flour. So less expensive flour, which doesn't have as much gluten. Because you have more yeast, your gluten network is not broken down as quickly compared to a regular starter. I think this definitely makes sourdough bread making a lot easier, especially if you're getting started. So stiff starter is a really, really good option. Now, if you change your water quantity from a regular or liquid starter to a stiff starter, it will take a few days for your new microorganisms to adapt to the new environment. So just keep feeding your starter. And please use your nose to test. It should smell relatively nice and mild. You'll notice a little bit of alcoholic flavors coming from your starter. That's because the yeast is producing CO2 and ethanol. Interestingly, the ethanol is actually fermented by the bacteria. Everything is used what's inside of your flour. Super fascinating. Just keep going over a few days, you will get there. Turn over your jar and look for some nice bubbles. That's a good indicator. If you're using a wholemeal flour, it might be that you just have to use a tiny little bit more water so that you get a little bit of extensibility inside of the dough. Number 9, can you dehydrate your sourdough starter for long-term storage? Yes, you can definitely do that. I've done that before. Actually, scientists have found yeast spores that are 250 million years old. When you dehydrate your starter will go into emergency mode and produce those spores. I'm not 100% sure about the bacteria, but I guess they behave in a similar way. You just dehydrate it, and then afterwards you have to reactivate it with a couple of feedings and it's going to be good as new. Super fascinating. I always have a spare starter like this in my flat in case something goes wrong. Oh, and yes, I'm actually selling my sourdough starter. I'm going to be sharing the link to that in the description. So if you're interested in using a little bit of bread pit, then that's something you might be interested. I'm taking my starter wherever I'm traveling. From a scientific perspective though, it doesn't make so much sense. Because your microorganisms are not friendly to foreigners. There are billions of them inside, and whatever is coming from the outside, they will be very protective. Still though, my starter is relatively old, so it's very good at fermenting flour. And you support the channel. So if you like that, please do check that out in the description. Number 10, how much sourdough starter should I be using? Very easy answer. In winter times, I use around 20% of starter based on the flour. So for 1 kilogram of flour, that's 200 grams of sourdough starter. In summer times, I'm using around 10%, which would be 100 grams of flour. Which would be 100 grams of starter for 1000 grams of flour. That's because I'm always trying to aim for a main fermentation time where I put everything together, excluding the proofing stage, of around 10 hours. So based on the quantity, I can either speed things up or slow things down. If you're living in a very, very hot place, you might want to consider just to be using around 5% or even just 2.5% to get into that time zone. Number 11. For how long can I store my discard starter in the fridge? For a very, very, very long period of time. It's basically pickled flour. It can stay there for years, I guess. And yes, I just keep adding more discard to it. Seriously, this is flavor explosion. There are so many great ways to use this. Think of this as a very expensive, long fermented cheese. Discard is one of the tastiest things you have, and that's just a byproduct from making sourdough bread. Number 12. Can you make a mega starter out of all the starters you have inside of the community? Such a great, amazing question and idea. I thought about this too. Yes, this would work, but we would need to make sure that we have equal army sizes, because else there might be too many soldiers in one of the armies. And as I said before, the sourdough starters, they don't like other things entering their circle. So if we had equal army sizes, then it could be that in a big battle, one of the sourdough starters is going to win. The strongest microorganisms are going to outperform the others. Definitely a super interesting idea what would happen. Yeah, it might be the mega starter actually. This would be such a fun idea to test this out. I'm already super excited while talking about this. I would definitely need some help though on organizing all the deliveries and everything, but it would be worth trying this out totally. That was super fun, and yeah, let me end this with a special announcement. I'm currently in the process of writing a free book. Free because I believe that all the information on making great bread should be accessible to everybody around the world, and it shouldn't be limited by how much money you have. That's why I'm writing a digital book that's going to be free. However, to make this project possible, I need your financial support. I will be taking some time off from YouTube, and I will be using your money to pay for my expenses. I'm first going to be writing the first part of the book, and then afterwards we can decide which next chapters we want to include. This would be a dream come true, especially because it's going to be an amazing sourdough framework. It's not just a recipe, it's something that you can use to make every recipe there is. It's going to provide you with a very solid knowledge foundation that you need in order to succeed at making bread at home. And every homemade bread is a win because you know exactly what's inside. And we Germans are a little bit careful, for instance. We Germans like to eat a lot of sausages and nobody actually knows what's inside. But that changes when you make sourdough bread at home. Typically it's just flour, water, salt. Flour, water, salt, yes, just those three. So I'm going to be sharing the link in the description. Thank you so much for all the support. It truly means a lot. You are all amazing. Thank you. Also, thank you to all the monthly supporters. This really means a lot. You are making this channel possible. So thank you. May the gluten be strong with the supporters and of course everybody else. It should more time.